At the end of the 1,000 years, the ancient narrative describes something both unsettling and profound. Satan rises once more in rebellion. This final uprising is not a prolonged war, but a brief, decisive moment. It ends almost as quickly as it begins. Then, according to these interpretations, something far greater unfolds, something cosmic in scale. The universe itself, as humanity understands it, seems to collapse inward, as if the entire structure of existence is being drawn back into its origin. This idea is echoed in certain lesser-known traditions that speak of Jesus descending into the realm of the dead, not as a figure of defeat, but as one completing a hidden chapter of a much larger story. It's a perspective that suggests there is far more happening beneath the surface of familiar teachings than most people realize. In a moment that caught many off guard, Mel Gibson once paused mid-sentence during an interview and said something striking. This is a Bible the world was never supposed to find. He was referring to the Ethiopian Bible, a collection of over 80 books preserved for nearly 2,000 years in remote monasteries carved into cliffs. The Ethiopian Orthodox canon contains 81 books, sometimes even more depending on how it is counted. Gibson had spent years exploring early Christian history, but when he encountered these texts, something shifted in him. He spoke about them not with sensationalism, but almost like a confession. According to him, much of what people believe about the end times might be fundamentally misunderstood. This wasn't framed as a casual theory or a passing curiosity. It pointed toward a deeper question. What if important pieces of the story have been deliberately set aside centuries ago? To understand this, one must go back to 325 AD, when church leaders gathered under Roman influence to establish what would become the official canon of Christian scripture. During this process, certain texts were included, while others were excluded. Over time, the Western Bible settled into the familiar 66-book structure recognized today. For many, this version represents a complete and unchangeable body of sacred knowledge. However, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church followed a different path. Their Bible preserved a much broader collection of writings, texts that were once widely read and respected in early Christian communities. Among them are the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, along with other writings often referred to as the Apocrypha. These works were not fringe ideas. They were central to how early believers understood morality, the nature of humanity, and the unfolding of history. As Christianity became more institutionalized, especially under Roman authority, these texts gradually faded from the Western tradition. They were not necessarily destroyed, but they were no longer copied, taught, or widely shared. Over generations, they became largely forgotten. In Ethiopia, however, the story was different. For nearly 2 millennia, monks continued to preserve these writings with extraordinary care. They worked in isolation, often in monasteries built into mountainsides, far removed from political centers of power. These were not casual acts of preservation. They were deliberate, disciplined efforts passed down through generations. What's particularly fascinating is the belief that guided them. These monks did not see themselves as rebels rejecting the decisions of Rome. Instead, they believed they were guardians of something sacred, something meant for a future time. They preserved these texts with a quiet conviction that their full meaning would only be understood when the world was ready. Another factor contributed to their survival: language. Many of these texts were written in Guizi, an ancient Ethiopian language that very few people outside the tradition could read. For centuries, this created a natural barrier. Even if outsiders had access to the manuscripts, understanding them was nearly impossible. This linguistic isolation may have protected the text from being altered, challenged, or removed. It wasn't until the modern era that scholars began to seriously study and translate these writings. One of the key figures in this effort was Ephraim Isaac, whose work helped bring texts like the Book of Enoch into wider academic discussion. What researchers discovered was unexpected. These writings did not simply offer alternative stories or additional historical details. They presented a fundamentally different perspective on the future, one that focused less on external events and more on internal transformation. Instead of describing the end of the world as a series of dramatic catastrophes, they described it as a gradual shift in human consciousness. According to these texts, the final age of humanity unfolds in 4 stages. The first stage is called the Age of Forgetting. This is not marked by sudden collapse, but by a slow drift. People gradually stop seeking truth, not because they reject it outright, but because they become distracted. Deep questions fade into the background. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Truth begins to feel inconvenient, and that inconvenience becomes enough reason to avoid it. The second stage is the age of spectacle. In this phase, noise replaces wisdom. Constant stimulation overwhelms the ability to think deeply. People become highly skilled at distraction, but increasingly unfamiliar with stillness. The text described this as a spiritual crisis, a condition where humanity loses access to something essential because it can no longer hear anything beyond the loudest voices. The third stage is the age of the false shepherd. Here, leadership becomes corrupted from within. These false shepherds do not appear as obvious villains. They speak the language of faith, build institutions, and appear legitimate. Yet their motivations are rooted in power and self-interest. They comfort the comfortable and ignore the suffering. Their danger lies in how difficult they are to recognize. The fourth and final stage is the great silence. This is not a peaceful quiet, but a profound emptiness. Spiritual awareness becomes so faint that even those searching for meaning struggle to feel it. It is not that the divine has disappeared, but that humanity has drifted so far that it can no longer perceive it. Alongside these stages, the text describes something called the seven seals. But unlike the dramatic imagery found in Revelation, these seals represent internal conditions within individuals. They include comfort, avoiding truth to stay at ease; false certainty, believing one already knows everything; fear, prioritizing security over truth; distraction, constant noise preventing reflection; echo chambers, only engaging with confirming viewpoints; false grace, using forgiveness as an excuse not to change; and hollow religion, performing belief without inner transformation. Together, these seals describe a deeply personal struggle. The real battle of the final age is not fought in the sky or on battlefields. It is fought within each person. Another striking concept found in these writings is the idea of a final empire. This is not a political nation or military power, but a system of life built on comfort, distraction, and the illusion of freedom. People within it do not feel oppressed. They feel entertained, informed, and engaged. Yet this very sense of freedom prevents them from recognizing their captivity. The text suggests that the most effective form of control is one that feels like choice. And then, perhaps most surprisingly, comes the idea of the final witness. According to this prophecy, the final witnesses of the age are not angels or supernatural beings. They are ordinary people, individuals who see clearly what is happening around them and refuse to remain silent. They are not celebrated or elevated by institutions. In fact, they are often dismissed, ignored, or silenced, yet their voices matter. The text emphasizes that truth does not require a platform. It does not depend on recognition or authority. It resonates where it is meant to be heard, within those who are ready to receive it. This idea was likely controversial in early church history. A message suggesting that truth could emerge outside established authority structures would have challenged the growing institutional power of the church. Some scholars believe this is one reason such texts were excluded from the Western canon. Despite this, Ethiopian monks continue preserving them generation after generation, and the message they guarded does not end in despair. It ends with a promise. The end is not the end of life, but the end of illusion. Those who choose truth and love, even in a world driven by comfort and appearance, are not forgotten. They are recognized not by status or power, but by their endurance and authenticity. For centuries, these writings remain hidden in remote monasteries, carefully copied by hand under the glow of oil lamps. The monks who preserved them believed that one day a generation would emerge ready to understand them. The question is no longer whether that generation would come. The question is whether it is already here.